everyone to our webinar this afternoon called Billing for a Productive Relationship. I'm very honored and grateful to have an esteemed panel here who I'll be introducing to all of you momentarily. Just a few reminders to the viewers of the webinar that the webinar is being recorded and that the attendees will be muted. However, we are encouraging you to ask questions in the chat, which we will be monitoring, and we will try to answer throughout the webinar, but we also have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So first, I'd like to start out by introducing our panel. I will be the moderator for today's panel, and I'm a managing director with PricewaterhouseCoopers, where we have a legal business services solutions practice. Next, I'd like to hand it over to each of the speakers to introduce themselves briefly. So Purvi, I'll start with you.
Thank you, David. I'm Purvi Sanghvi. I'm the Director of Strategic Pricing at Paul Hastings, and I'm a founding board member of the Legal Value Network.
Thank you. Vinny?
Hi, I'm Vinny Scarinci. I'm practice group leader at Intapp, focusing in on the area of operations and finance for law firms.
And Joshua?
Thanks, David. I'm the Director of Risk Analytics at Validity Finance. We're a litigation finance company, and I do a lot of work on how we work out what a litigation is worth.
So the legal pricing and project management survey, really, it's our second year of running this particular service, or survey rather. We cover all sorts of different things, but what we find is that law firms are changing, and their pricing and legal project management professionals are actually driving this change. And so what we intend to do here today is talk about some of the key findings of that survey, but also how they match up to the Law Department Operations Survey. That Law Department Operations Survey has been done over the last 14 years. I'm one of the co-founders of that survey, but really what it's intended to do is get the audience here different perspectives on how the law department professionals see those particular data points, but also how the legal pricing and project management folks are looking at those particular data points. We wouldn't be anywhere without our legal pricing and project management advisory board. Many of the folks here are lifetime participants in the world of changing within legal, but Purvi, it's also supported a lot by the Legal Value Network, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what that network is all about and what your mission is all about.
Absolutely, thank you. We started just 2 years ago. We celebrated our second birthday just recently, and what we're aiming to do is bring together the people that are helping change the way legal services are offered, from pricing, project management, practice innovation, practice efficiency folks. It really doesn't have any boundaries in terms of the kinds of roles, but the people on the business professional side who are looking to make changes and become better at what we do. And it provides a platform for people to grow, connect, develop, and network. So we offer a variety of educational content and opportunities for people to meet and network and become better at what they're doing, bring that value back to where they work.
Thank you very much. And in fact, there's a roadshow happening or starting pretty soon,
yes.
Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes. So we're having our first in-person gathering, which we're very excited about. We're doing a series of roadshows between Chicago, London, New York, and Washington, D.C. over the course of April and May. So you can stay tuned for more information on that. Look for our website and LinkedIn messages. And then later in September this year, we'll be having our first conference in Chicago.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And thank you for all
Thank
your
you.
efforts. I also want to spend time to thank our sponsors who, without their really support of what we're doing here, we couldn't pull any of this off. And so thank you for our folks at Intapp, Validity, and LexFusion for, again, their continued support of our efforts. I'm very grateful for what you do for us. So now to the meat of the session today, which is really, we're going to talk about some specific data points and have discussion around them. And again, I encourage the folks on the webinar to bring their questions forward if they have them. So let's actually start with the first data point, which is pressure to bill hours impedes our ability to meet budgets and deliver results efficiently. This year's respondents said that 52% said that pressure to bill hours is actually impeding the ability to meet the budgets and deliver efficiently. And so, Porvi, I guess I want to start with you. Is this similar to what you're seeing, and what might be driving the ability to actually be more efficient or to meet the budgets as it relates to how that's billed?
Sure. What I'll point out is that there has been a slight change in terms of the amount of agreement. So I think the needle's moving in the right direction, and that people are trying to adapt their ways of working to be able to conform to budgets, deliver work efficiently, but then still understand that there's other work to be had in order to meet their hours requirements. But there's still a little bit of a tug and pull with the need, especially in the associate ranks at law firms, with the need to make sure that their hours are there. And the last couple of years, although law firm demand has been there and has been steady, I think the underlying theme is that there's always that push and that understanding. So as firms become more well-versed in managing to budgets and alternative fee arrangements, it's weaving that practice into the entire ranks of all of the lawyers to have them understand that, okay, if you're doing something to be more efficient, deliver that value for the client. And I think they're getting that. It's just having that back end understanding of saying, okay, well, how do we then fill the rest of the hours? How do we then bring on other projects? How do we, collaborate and staff efficiently so that volume and that pipeline is always there? So for me, I feel like the needle's moving in the right direction, but there's still a little bit of a tug and pull there with that.
And how about the underlying technology or support mechanisms in your back office to actually track things effectively and efficiently? Has that been improving over time as well, just the actual mechanisms or mechanics?
Yes, it's getting better. And so whereas before maybe management was a little bit blind in terms of seeing where there was availability and where's capacity currently, we're getting better at seeing that and then planning for it.
And Vinny, how about the folks at Intapp? Anything that you folks have been doing to kind of address these particular needs?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, what we're seeing across the board is, the billable hour is certainly is being stretched. I think, people are coming to market with a whole bunch of different alternative fee arrangements. And on the budget side, it's like, people want to put a budget in place ahead of time. We are kind of under the belief that every matter deserves a budget. I don't think law firms are quite there yet with that, but we see a world where every matter does get to a budget, and we're putting technology in place to help law firms get to that point.
Thank you, Vinny. And sticking with you on the next data point, but before I move to that, there was a question as to whether we would share the slides after the presentation, and I believe the answer is yes, unless my cohorts will tell me differently, but the answer is yes, and we'll figure out how to get those out to you. So Vinny, just sticking with you for a second, there's another data point that says that we've been fired or a client has stopped working with us because we've failed to follow outside counsel billing guidelines or other instructions. What's interesting to me here is that there's a 33% difference as to whether that's actually happened. So on the law department operations side, 43% of the respondents said, yes, in fact, we have fired a client. On the legal pricing and project management side, only 10% have that revelation. So I'm curious, what do you think is driving that? And is that an interesting story for you?
Well, first of all, I love the big numbers in webinars like this, because I think it really showcases the value of a webinar in the communities like the Legal Value Network that bring both sides of the conversation together. For me, I think what we look at here is this really showcases off how hard transparency is in the process. We're seeing outside guidelines getting more sophisticated. It's getting harder to sort of keep up pace with the council guidelines. And it's hard for law firms internally to track this. A lot of times it comes down to a manual process to make sure that you're in compliance. Now, we are seeing that a lot of law firms are putting technology in place to make sure that there are no surprises after the fact, and that it's not until after the matter is at closure where the surprise hits the law firm. I think most attorneys know if they've been fired, but I think a lot of times people look at silence as something that means satisfaction with the matter. And I think what we're seeing here in these numbers is that, you know, silence doesn't always mean satisfaction. It could mean that they're actually seeking counsel someplace else.
You know, it's interesting. One of the other data points not highlighted here, though, is the whole idea or notion that a lot of law firms don't actually actively seek out that feedback, right? They rest on that silence, so I think that's an interesting point. And even in the LDO or the ops community, there still aren't a lot of formalized programs around doing quarterly or annual reviews. So I think that's also interesting in terms of, you know, how do these relationships get better and stronger if we're not communicating with each other on how to meet each other's needs and objectives from a business perspective. So I think that's very interesting. So Joshua, over to you. You know, we have a discussion here about our clients do a good job at suggesting alternative fee arrangements that meet their needs. Again, here we see that 24% of the legal pricing and project management folks believe that's the case. And on the legal operations side here, what we're talking about is 34% think that the firms are doing a good job at suggesting these alternative fee arrangements, so, or that meet our needs. So again, we see a gap or a difference of 10%. So let me strike that. The legal operations professionals, 34% of them think they're doing a good job at suggesting to their clients good alternative fee structures, whereas 24% say, nah, probably not the case. So again, a disconnect here. Can you address that or give some insights into that?
Yeah, I think one of the things I find interesting in thinking about this data point is not just the difference, it's that whichever number you go with, it's pretty low, right? And I think that one of the issues here may be what people mean when they're talking about meeting needs. You know, I don't think it's as simple as is it too expensive or not. There's a cost component on both sides. I mean, a law firm doesn't want to have uncompensated hours and a client doesn't want to have bills that are too high. I think there's a value component that often pushes in the opposite direction on many alternative fee structures. Like the client doesn't want to pay a large fixed fee if the matter ends up being pretty simple. There's a timing component to people's needs. You know, does it matter whether you're paying upfront, incurred, like an hourly, or at the end, like a contingency, a success fee? And there's a litigation risk component. I mean, how much of your costs or for the firm revenue are you prepared to have be contingent on the outcome of litigation? And I wonder how often these different parts of people's needs in a fee structure are really being broken out and how many conversations are being had explicitly about the different components. You know, as funders, we often prompt clients and lawyers to have these conversations because our job is largely to find structures that both sides can live with. So, you know, you might have a no cost to the clients until the end and lawyers receive a portion of their billable hours or whatever. So they're having different structures and we sort of make it fit together. But when we do have those conversations, we often find that there are sort of additional needs beyond even sort of the simple ones that I listed. And some of them can be quite individual and unique to the people we're talking to, but some of them come up often, like people really care about what happens in a low return scenario or a high return scenario. Anyway, I think just sort of the broader point on this is that in order to be meeting somebody's needs, you have to understand what those needs are. And I think there may be too much assumption that people do and not enough sort of explicitly breaking up the different components of what those needs are and sort of finding structures that work with all of those different aspects of it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And look, oftentimes also it's the clients who struggle to even articulate what those needs are because they're struggling to put parameters and words around the things they're trying to accomplish with their alternative fee arrangements. And I think that's a real part of this discussion as well.
I think that's right. And you can help clients, though, do that by providing them the language to talk about it, right? Asking them questions about these specific different ways in which value might be important to them, and giving them the language to talk about, oh yeah, we really do care about what happens in a low return scenario, but we don't care about timing. Like, it doesn't matter if we pay today or tomorrow. That'll be different for different people.
Okay. Vinny, just a question that came from the group, and I think it's one on the previous slide, but worth noting here. Is Intapp doing anything with their terms product to address being able to give greater transparency into the council guidelines? Do you have any insight into that you could share?
Yeah, for sure. The terms product is all about council guidelines, right? And for us, what we like to do is think about terms as kind of like really the front end of the compliance story. And we try and incorporate compliance into the entire platform. So connecting compliance, not just pulling the terms out of the guidelines, but actually injecting that down into like the time capture process, for example, right? So we're trying to keep the timekeeper compliant through every step of the process as much as we can with our technology.
Thank you, Vinny, for sharing that. So, Porvi, kind of touching on a point I just thought about prior to this slide here. Most clients don't know how to evaluate or structure AFAs. And overwhelmingly, your colleagues and peers agree that they're just not good at that. That number really hasn't changed from the previous year. So, in fact, hasn't changed at all. So the question is, one, is this your experience? And two, what are some of the things that the client should be thinking about to maybe better evaluate or structure these AFAs so that you folks can be more effective at your jobs in helping meet the client objectives?
I think this goes back to a little bit of what Joshua was just talking about as well in terms of communication. I think there are times where it's just easier to fall back on an hourly arrangement because it's comfortable, it's known, the metric around it is easy to measure, and it's easy to show savings if it's a discount off of an hourly rate, sometimes from the client perspective, especially if they're budget constrained. And sometimes wading into the territory of an AFA, it's a little bit unknown. And there are unknowns, and understanding that it needs to be a malleable process and that it will evolve as the engagement evolves. And sometimes clients aren't very comfortable with that. So I think having that, investing the time up front to define what is value, what's your pain point, what are you looking for, and can an alternative fee arrangement help solve those things? And then providing the client with the language to take back to their management to say, okay, we traditionally do things this way. I want to try this. Here's why. This is what we're going to do. Here's the risk sharing portion of it. Here's the transparency portion of it. If you're able to define that, I found greater compliance or greater willingness and collaboration on the client side to work on things, because you're then giving them the things they need to satisfy the metrics they usually measure when just using an hourly arrangement. So it's more investment up front, and depending on the needs of the client, sometimes you have time, the luxury of time to do that. Sometimes you don't. And I think it's just putting the right people in the room together, which often involves making sure that we've got the right counterparts, like my position and my position on the client side, also talking with the attorneys. So it's a comprehensive discussion.
And how open are your clients with regard to your experience with other clients in structuring an AFA for this particular matter type? So if you think about an M&A, for example, as an organization, I may be doing 2 a year or 3 a year. Right. As a law firm, you might be doing 200 a year.
Right.
So how open are they to hearing your insights about how these have been structured in other instances or what your data shows?
More and more open to it is what I'm seeing. In fact, I'm being prompted to provide examples in a lot of the RFPs that we're answering now, more so than I was before, to showcase examples, even if it's from a non-related practice or a different area. It's just telling the story to showcase how comfortable they could become with you as being well-versed in managing these kinds of things.
Wonderful, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, Vinny, on this particular topic, then I believe that work done under alternative fee arrangements is more cost efficient than work done hourly. And again, here we see a difference where LPPMs actually agree that it is more cost efficient than work done hourly. And the legal operations folks, the LDO folks, responded that about 64% of them thought about that. So what insights or comments would you have on this particular point around how effective or efficient that work is being done as opposed to hourly?
Yeah, no, I think when I look at numbers, I like to sort of see if there's any correlation to other data sets. And what I want to do is have the audience think about this one in correlation to the shadow billing details that we're going to showcase a little bit later, because I think there's a nice correlation between the two data points. Now, I think what we see here is that we have a large chunk of the LDOs that are very pleased, right? So we're at 64%. I think that's a good number, but the gap really showcases that I think some of the LDOs are uncertain if this is really a cost-effective manner or not versus the hourly rates that they were getting in the past. So to me, this starts to shift towards the shadow billing process, right? And I think that what we're seeing is that folks are asking for a little bit more transparency so that they can build more confidence in the AFA arrangements so that they know that these are a cost-effective approach versus the hourly rate.
So Vinny, you've touched upon maybe the third rail of alternative fee arrangements, but we'll get to that in terms of the whole concept of shadow billing, because I think that'll be an interesting perspective. And there are several perspectives on that, but I think your point is well taken. And maybe it leads us to our next point for Joshua to address, which is, listen, when we talk about measuring the value of legal services, is it in fact more art than science? And here we almost have uniform agreement that it is more art than science. I wonder if you have a different view, given that's a main thrust of your business, right?
Right. So I think this question kind of underpins a lot of the answers to the other questions that we're seeing as well. I mean, if you don't think that you have a good way of valuing legal services, it's really hard to value something new and something you haven't looked at before. And certainly, as you said, David, one of the most important parts of my risk analysis job is to try and work with both the art and the science of valuing litigation. Funders invest in precisely this value. So by necessity, we have tools for putting numbers on what you might think of as just sort of legal judgment calls. But that doesn't mean that I disagree with people here. I do think that ultimately it's more art than it is science. Where I would start to maybe disagree with people is to say, I think people underrate the extent to which the science is useful for informing the art. And I'll explain that in slightly less abstruse terms. But litigation has inherent uncertainty. It's not an asset class where if you could just do the right analysis, you would know that the lawsuit is worth $20 million in 24 months, right? That's not an analysis you can perform. But you can certainly tell the difference between a lawsuit that might bring in, has a good chance of $20 million, or it's just terrible, or a good chance of $200 million. And the art comes in the expertise, the experience, the judgment, the earned intuition of litigators who are able to look at that legal analysis and provide you with some sense of how this litigation fits and sort of what the range might be of reasonable outcomes. The science comes in, though, when you take that judgment, which is the centerpiece of an analysis, and you use tools that are out there, modeling tools, some data that's out there about duration and costs and things like that, but a lot of modeling tools and a lot of processes that make sure you don't omit something from your analysis and that help you compare cases that look very different from each other. We have to take a patent case and an antitrust case and a breach of contract case and every kind of case and put them next to each other and say, oh, this one is riskier than that one. This one has higher or lower returns than that one, right? And to do that, you have to find ways of comparing them, even though your judgment that is the centerpiece is ultimately uncertain. It's really a way, the science ends up helping you measure and understand the uncertainty that the art, the judgment is letting you come to. And I think valuing legal services falls out of this naturally. I hate it when people describe litigation counsel, outside or corporate, as a cost center. That suggests to me that you aren't working out ahead of time what your litigation is worth, and then comparing that to the results you get at the end. Litigation teams add value by reducing defense side liabilities and maximizing plaintiff side returns. And without the science and the modeling side, I think supporting the art and judgment side, I think it's much more difficult to understand and quantify this value add and to communicate it to the business folks who don't have a legal training. And so even though I agree it's more art than science, I think the science has a lot to add and is actually very valuable.
But Joshua, how do you see getting that science more pervasive in the industry? Because companies like yourself, that's part of your secret sauce. It's part of your analysis of how you expand your business. So where do you see the models growing and being shared across practitioners to really drive it more towards science? Or where are the gaps that we haven't seen that kind of scale?
Well, we'll always share a model. And I think there needs to be a lot. I think all funders need to be willing to share their models, to explain how they're thinking about it. But also, law firms and in-house counsel have a lot of data themselves that and sometimes they have more data than we do. Law firms have a huge amount of data about their prior results and the kinds of fee arrangements that have worked for them, and can do a lot of analysis there. And and companies have a lot of analysis, especially companies that do a lot of litigation, can look at past results and try to understand what their expectations were at the beginning, or at least start to write down what their expectations are at the beginning so that they can compare it to what they're getting at the end. So I think first, there's more data out there than people realize. Second, there should be more willingness to share, and we will do CLEs or talk to people, whatever people want to understand how to value this process, how to go through the process. So I think that's a mechanism by which it can get into the industry. And the last part is just, I think, competition, right? As law firms have to compete, and as clients get ever more sophisticated about how they want to see litigation spend organized, there's going to be a need to make sure you understand what you're investing in. And that's going to drive interest, I think, in modeling and understanding how to cabin uncertainty.
Porvi, so interesting, law firms have a lot of data, but oftentimes they having to deal with legacy decisions around how that data was collected or how it's used. Is that a challenge you see amongst the LVN leadership or LVN members? And what are some of the things they're trying to do to address some of those things?
Yeah, I mean, data is like the root issue, in terms of firms becoming more sophisticated with how they manage their matters, using task codes, using more sophisticated legal project management practices. You have that with more current information. You might not have that with prior information. And when you're trying to answer a question of, well, how did we perform on this kind of an engagement? And what was the value that was derived for the client? Sometimes you don't have the whole picture because of the fact that you may not have reclassified your entire history of existence. But I see that as firms are getting more sophisticated with using these tactics, using these practices, that we're amassing that data. We're getting to a point where we can have metrics that we can analyze, and that we're able to use those data points to help tell the story of what was accomplished, what were the successes. I also see that you have to have the right people in these positions to help guide that story, because it's not just a numbers conversation. And you'll hear me say that all the time. Pricing is not just a numbers conversation, because it's your client relationship. So you manage this matter. Yes, these are the fees that were charged. Yes, this is the realization or the revenue that was collected or the profit. I mean, those are very hard black and white metrics, but how do you weave that into the story of what that did for your client. And that's a cross-functional comprehensive discussion. And I think that goes back to what Josh was just talking about. How do you weave the art and the science together in order to be able to tell that? And sometimes for the law firm side, it's taking the proactive initiative to create that story and then give it back to the client, whether or not they ask for it, but just to showcase that, because I've found that they're more appreciative of seeing it laid out that way. And we'll often come to the conclusion and say, yes, actually, I agree with your findings here, and this is how we've done it. So that's sort of what I'm seeing on the firm side. I hope that helps answer the question.
It does. Thank you. And I guess to all of you on this point, just one last point, has anyone really done a nice job at defining what the value of a legal service is? I mean, oftentimes we focus on the inputs, not the outputs. Yeah. So, has anyone in your experience done a good job or been able to articulate what value is as it relates to the outputs of the work that's being done?
I think it depends what you mean. If you mean like the outputs, like this memo, that brief, this letter, I think that's very difficult to do. If you're talking outputs in terms of ultimate results, then yes, people are doing that. I mean, the funding industry runs on that, right? I mean, we have to get an investment approved by our investment committee. So we say, we think this is worth X. And at the end, we find out what it was worth. And we don't expect to be right all the time. In fact, we expect to be wrong a very significant amount of the time. But over enough instances, you start to see whether, as a general matter, you're getting it right or not. And the success of the funding industry as a whole kind of shows that this is a project that you can absolutely do, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry now every year. So this is something that works. You can value it, you can invest in it, you can work out what those outputs are going to be ahead of time with enough certainty to put money behind that. And I think that law firms and clients need to understand that they're doing the same thing funders are doing. Right? They're just not running the same analyses at the beginning. If a law firm is investing its time, that's an investment. If a client is paying for legal services, that's an investment, right? If you have a plaintiff side litigation, that's an asset that needs to be maximized. Defense side litigation is a liability that needs to be minimized. These are financial products in addition to being litigations. And yeah, you just have to start, once you start thinking about them that way, I think it's not actually that difficult to start putting some rough numbers with acknowledged uncertainty on it at the beginning and comparing it to the results you get at the end.
And Joshua, as someone who's actually sat in that seat in-house, and your talk about maybe sharing your models, and Porvi, some of your talk about leading them there, I think that's something that the clients really do need. They don't have the resources to think about this in the same way, in the same depth as organizations like yourselves are doing. So I think that's a takeaway for all of us here, is that leading your clients through that journey, I think, would be very, very helpful as well for all of us. So on to that next data point. Thank you, everyone, for your comments there. Vinny had talked about this a little bit about shadow billing. And shadow billing, is it an effective way to measure the value of fixed fees? The operations professionals, overwhelmingly, almost 50% of them said it is, whereas the legal pricing and project manager said not so much, almost a 31% difference there. So, Porvi, I want to start with you. There's a huge difference here in discrepancy. So what do you think that's about?
I think it's about understanding how things are managed differently when you alter the fee arrangement. Perhaps there hasn't been enough conversation and communication around why things are different. If a firm and a client have agreed to a fixed fee, then how is that being managed differently than if it were just done on an hourly basis? And it's hard. It's a crutch still, using that hourly analysis to assume that a fixed fee, were it managed on a time and materials basis, then this is the comparative comparison. I don't think it's apples to apples, but the comparison is consistently drawn between the two. And I think a little unfairly, because there's a lot of risks that the firm is taking on by managing to a fixed fee to make sure that we're staying within the scope and what we said would happen. But in that, there's a different delegation of duties. There's different assumptions being made in terms of how things are being managed. And perhaps the way that that's happening inside the firm, that the value derived there isn't communicated necessarily onto the client side. And that's something I think both sides have to do a better job of communicating and understanding. Maybe it's that post-mortem analysis that we often strive to do at the end of an engagement. And so I think that's the reason why a lot of this variance still exists. And it's unfortunate. I'm not a fan of having to show shadow billing. So anytime a client asks for it, I do try to back it up with having more of a conversation around the performance of an engagement and what were the goals and the successes that were achieved alongside the numerical savings.
And have you had more successes around having those discussions that we're talking about the value of a fixed fee, and you know what? The problem we're trying to solve may be worth $1 million to you, and that's what our fixed fee is, regardless of the ultimate effort and time and billing or time that we put in. I mean, are you having more successes in those conversations, and are the buyers becoming more conditioned to that type of arrangement?
Yeah, we are, but not far and wide. I think there's still a lot of room for growth there.
Vinny or Joshua, do you
yeah, I mean, perspectives? One perspective here is that I think when a client agrees to a fixed fee, they're buying two things. They're buying the legal services that fixed fee entitles them to, but they're also buying cost certainty, which they didn't have before, because if they had to do it on an hourly basis, they might end up paying more or less than that fixed fee. And that certainty has value as well, right? I mean, the law firm is taking a risk that this project that they've agreed to do for $1 million could end up costing them $2 million in time. They're also, getting the benefit if it takes only $500,000 in time. But what they're selling is a combination of those two things. They're selling both the services, the quality of the services they're providing, and that certainty. And so one thing that jumped out to me in this question is, shadow billing is an effective way to measure the value of fixed fees. It might be a useful tool. I think you could have arguments one way or the other about whether it's one of the useful tools and a lens through which it's helpful to understand what's being delivered. But I don't think it would be fair to say that it measures everything that you got from a fixed fee.
One thing I would add on to that, I think, when you look at the AFA, what the LDOs are actually doing is they're shifting the risk, right, back to the law firm. And the law firm takes on that risk as part of the AFA arrangement. And when you start to get into sort of this shadow billing concept, to me, I think, when you step forward with your AFA arrangement, you're taking on that risk and the responsibility. And this gets into sort of that art and science, right? I think when law firms step up, deliver their AFA, there is that art and science that's been delivered behind the scene to mitigate as much risk as possible for the law firm to deliver that work, be successful for their clients, and, along the way, make a little bit of money as part of this engagement without really risking the law firm's reputation or the delivery of that matter. So, it's that kind of back and forth between the risk. And, I think law firms are doing a great job rising to the occasion to take on that risk factor.
Thank you for that, Vinny. So Purvi, I have a question from the audience where, there's agreement that there should be a better way to balance better way than shadow billing to measure value. I guess the question is, are LPPMs doing something or using something different to measure value Or are they too struggling to find an effective way to measure the value of fixed fees? Even as you report back to your own folks, for example, are your peers having similar type struggles?
I would say there is still a struggle, but I think it's because there isn't going to be a one way to measure it every single time. Every engagement differs. So depending on what the needs were for that engagement, the answer is going to be different every time. And so it's understanding and implementing a process that fits that need, if you will. So understanding were there inefficiencies along the way? If so, looking at what could have been done different, what could have been done better. And then on the flip side, what was managed really well? What provided the efficiencies that were created with this fixed fee? And understanding, was that because of staffing? Was that because of all the different levers that a law firm can control in order to create a good, efficient, profitable outcome? I think it's understanding what those are and understanding what the client's needs and pain points are to weave that into the conversation as to how we measure it. So it's a convoluted way of just saying, I think it's going to differ every time. And I think because of that, there's still a little bit of struggle with understanding how do you create a process around that when it differs every time.
Fair point. So I guess I'd ask all the panelists, what are some of those specific indicators of inefficiency? I mean, Porvi, you talked about staffing,
yeah,
right, to the right level. Do all of you have insights into what else would be indicators of inefficient or ineffective ways of handling a matter? What are some of the other things you've seen? Is it failure to reuse or leverage existing or pre-existing work product? Is it too much time on a particular task? And oh, by the way, how do we determine what too much time is on a particular task? Is it inefficiencies in handoff of the work from one staff member to the other? I mean, I guess those are some of the things I would see, but are any of you seeing anything else or different that you could contribute to help folks understand what is an ineffective way to kind of measure that behavior, or to look at that behavior? What are some of those ineffective ways?
One thing I would add is that I think for a lot of law firms, the jumping off point on matters is sometimes is deep in the art section, if you will, right? I think sometimes when you're looking at matters, maybe you have an experience management system that you could dig into to figure out what matters might be similar. But oftentimes it takes a lot of human coordination behind the scenes to figure out like what work you've done in that particular area. Mm-hmm. That's similar type of representation. And, to me, that becomes a very inefficient way to start the matter off, is like going person to person, if you will, or sometimes it's a mass communication to gain insight into a particular matter. And, to me, being a technology person, you can see where technology could easily fill that gap, and not every law firm has those types of systems in place to jump right in and get an efficient way to start off with a matter.
Yeah, I think building on that, and I agree with what Vinny said, but building on that, you have to think about the way different fee structures incentivize different behaviors by the law firm, and how that translates into different results. So, as an example, a fixed fee structure tends to incentivize trying to get a faster resolution, right? A more efficient, quicker resolution. And that could be exactly what the client wants, right? Sometimes clients want this to go away. And so incentivizing your lawyers to move this quickly to a resolution may be exactly a good thing. Other times, we've seen, everybody who's worked on a matter which is a billable hour matter with no budget, and bet the company, whatever. We all know the kinds of work that gets done in those situations. to try and run down every avenue. And some of that can be inefficient just because it doesn't go anywhere, though it can still be the right thing to do if a client wants to exhaust every possibility. But oftentimes it's not. But it also produces disruption, right? Like sometimes a client really cares about how many of my executives are you making sit for 8 hours to talk to you? How many different people have to have conversations with me about whether their documents are going to be collected, and have to have conversations about some awkward email they sent, right? There's all sorts of different ways in which the practice of litigation can be disruptive for a company beyond, the dollars that you paid as fees and the outcome at the end of it. And when you think about an alternative fee structure and the value of that alternative fee structure, you should be also thinking about the kind of process that you're incentivizing. And a fixed fee tends to incentivize less disruption. It tends to incentivize faster resolutions because that's in the law firm's interest. They're still going, if you've got the right lawyers, you're still going to get A+ service because that's their ethical obligation, and that's their reputation, and it's essential to their entire business and existence as lawyers. But they're going to be incentivized to do it in a different way. That might be what you want. If it is what you want, you shouldn't necessarily be surprised that that produces a bonus over hourly rates to the lawyers, because you were trying to incent them to do precisely that kind of behavior. And you did.
Okay. Let's just a reminder, we're in our last home stretch here of the presentation and the webinar. Q&A session will be at the end, and we welcome those questions if you wish. But the last point I'd want to bring up is kind of a round robin, so feel free to jump in as and when you feel inspired to do so. But the whole idea about law department operations professionals make it materially easier to drive innovation in services, fees, and AFAs. Here we have pretty much similar agreement that, in fact, law department operations professionals, and I would argue also law department operations disciplines across those organizations, have made it easier to drive these innovations. So despite some of our challenges, there's some agreement here that it is becoming easier. So Vinny, Joshua, Porvi, what are your thoughts? Yes? No? Certainly, I guess it'd be harder to say no with some of the interactions we have, but what are some of your feelings about that?
I mean, I agree with it. Part of me just looks at this and says, well, duh, as a law firm, it's my job to service the client. If the client's asking for something, then that's going to naturally create processes and change within the firm. But, I say that in jest a little bit. The frequency and the nature of which these requests are coming from all of our clients across all of the industries, across all the different practice areas, it shines a light on the need for the business of law to be responsive, to, be more innovative and figure out how to have the solutions available that meet their needs. So I think that has certainly helped drive innovation in our firm.
I would add, I think I look at, because we're both in the 60% range here, that, I think that states that change is hard and innovation is hard sometimes, right? Like we would expect this to be much higher if we were both moving at a faster pace. Yeah. But the thing I really like about this is that there's only the 3% difference. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's about balance in the relationship. And I think that's really important. I think both sides are sort of moving in lockstep with change. And I think for innovation to really take hold, being kind of in sync is going to be an important part of that innovation path.
Thank you for those comments. I'm curious, and again, anyone, please feel free to answer this, but do you feel that law firms or providers of services are actually incentivizing their people adequately so that they are able to participate in innovative ideas and services or innovative fees and AFAs, or really some of the same metrics and measurements that we've used in the past still there that are preventing the providers of legal services from being more creative. So if you're being measured on the number of hours, then is it hard to come up with alternative fee structures or technologies or innovations that will reduce the actual thing that I'm being measured on as being successful or not successful? Are you seeing that as amongst your conversations that you're having?
I would say that I've seen it kind of run the gamut. I think I've seen it a little bit more in the UK market. I think people are a little bit more innovative in that marketplace. I think, you know, when all of your competitors live within kind of 1 square mile of your main office, I think that sparks a lot more innovation. It's, you know, people get a little bit more creative. But over here in the US, you know, we are seeing certain firms get really aggressive with some of that stuff. So if I were to kind of say nationally here in the US, I would say we're moderate. And in the UK, I think they're definitely more on the aggressive side of that equation.
Thank you for that.
One aspect of the way law firms structure themselves that has sort of an interesting interplay with this, I think, is partner compensation models. You know, partner compensation models that are eat what you kill or heavily biased towards eat what you kill encourage different kinds of behavior. I mean, some partners in that circumstance want to do a ton of contingency work because they believe in their ability to bring in huge outsized, you know, returns. But, you know, one thing that can be difficult to do is work out you know, a compensation system across a bunch of different practice areas, for example, because, you know, how do you value the input from this partner versus that partner? And, you know, if you have a fixed fee to distribute, do you just do it by hours? Do you do it, you know, in some other way? And so that structure can sometimes, I think, lead to hesitancy, not always because the structure would be bad for the partners, but because that there can be uncertainty and discomfort with not understanding how it will translate. But I mean, that's not universally true, but it is something I've seen on occasion, that there needs to be clarity as to how this is going to roll to the partner's bottom line sometimes.
Thank you for that, Joshua. Well, listen, I want to thank each and all of you for your comments today. I'm going to open the floor again for Q&A, although I think we've addressed many of them along the way. And so as we're waiting for new questions to come in, which may or may not happen, I want to remind people that you can download a copy of the report at LPPMsurvey.com. I want to thank you again to all of our sponsors for bringing us the support we need to bring this forward, and for the Blickstein Group for coordinating this, and the Legal Value Network for being a real good partner to us in this journey. I'm gonna say question and answers going once, twice. I think we will, no question and answers from the floor. So if anyone has any closing comments, feel free to share them at this point. Otherwise, I'm gonna say thank you for all of your time and for participating. Vinny, Joshua, or Porvi, any closing comments or remarks that you'd like to make? I'm going to take that as
thanks to everybody who helped set this up and organize it, and appreciate the conversation.
Yeah. Yep. And thanks. Yeah. Sorry, Porvi.
No, I was just going to say thank you, and I like the fact that we have this platform to discuss these sorts of metrics and see what trends are happening in the industry, and get the voices of all three parts of the ecosystem, you know, involved in this. I think it's great. So I love it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we look forward to seeing all of you live and in person at either a roadshow or industry events. I know there's a lot of those happening
Yes.
We're grateful for that. Again, Vinny, Joshua, and Porvi, thank you again for your participation in today's webinar. And again, look forward to seeing all of you out and about in the real world soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having
us.
Bye-bye.